And hello, everybody. Welcome back. We are having a follow-up to the very, very epic May episode of Only Forward. And for those of you who are listening at the moment, we're also going to be recording this again as a video and hosted on YouTube. But for now, I'd like to welcome back the panel from our last episode. And we have innovator and resident philosopher, co-founder of Phase One Insights, Tim Rayner. Welcome, Tim.
Hi, Jen. Great to be here.
Awesome. Also, back in the ring for round two is communications and collaborations expert Melissa Dark of Commonplace Communications and also Busting Silos. Welcome, Melissa.
Thanks, Jen.
And lastly, a very warm welcome back to Hayley Lewis of Halo Psychology, who is an esteemed organisational psychologist, my favourite one on tap, who you may know from her very clever sketch notes of research articles. Welcome, Hayley.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Super. Now, I've got to share with you listeners, our intent with this was to review the last 3 months against what we said in our Only Forward episode, which we recorded back in May. And look at what stood up, what didn't. Did anybody actually listen to our advice? Were we surprised by what happened? But last week we gathered to just review notes and check in with each other. And there was a really interesting turn of events. Now, Hayley, you weren't with us, but Melissa and Tim was. Perhaps, Melissa, would you like to share what went on when I asked, how do you feel about what we recorded in May?
Sure. I think our overall reflections were, well, certainly mine were that I was horribly optimistic the last time we met, and that I felt a great deal of humility, I suppose, around some of the solutions and ideas that I had at the time, because we were trying to predict, what things were looking like, and we said a lot about, what might come next, assuming that we were sort of through things and coming out the other side, and that hasn't exactly turned out to be correct. So I guess in comparison to last time, where I felt like I was really quite optimistic, I think this time I'm feeling a bit more pessimistic, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Melissa. Tim, what was going on for you when we caught up?
Well, I've always been a bit of a pessimist, so I haven't been too surprised by the way things have gone since, but I guess I have been feeling a bit stuck insofar as I teach leadership, and I try to enact the principles of leadership. I talk to a lot of leaders, and my overarching impression of what's happening in the moment is that people are just a bit paralyzed by the deep uncertainty of the situation. It's easy to take a sort of an abstract critical perspective on that and offer advice. But I guess when we met and I reflected on what I had to offer, I realized that I'm also feeling quite paralyzed by uncertainty and unsure of what to say, what to offer.
It was interesting because for the listeners' benefit, I'm in Melbourne. We are currently 2.5 weeks into a stage 4 lockdown, which is, quite restrictive. We've got curfews. We can't travel more than 5 kilometres. We can only have an hour of outside exercise a day. And there's only 4 reasons why you can leave your house. A lot more businesses have had to shut down as a result of this. And I think for me, what happened when stage 4 happened was this dawning realization of, okay, this is the cycles that we're now going to go through. That I may have once had a story in my head, which was, we can just get through this and stay calm and push through. We'll come out the other end okay. And when stage 4, the reality of stage 4 hit us, there was this question of, for someone who was always quite optimistic, this is what pessimism feels like, and I had one of my friends say to me, World War II, they went through this for 5 years. lives were lost, workplaces had to change considerably. Supply chains were disrupted, and this went on for 5 years. And, that conversation was really quite daunting for me. And it kind of happened at the same time that I've been having this really strong puzzlement verging on scorn for why are leaders just focusing on tightening belts and no long-term planning, or why aren't they looking for opportunities? And they're certainly not looking at how do we redesign the organization, as a result of this. And then I sort of stopped and went, well, crap, if I'm feeling this way, who am I to expect leaders to be feeling any different? And I think as we had this chat last week, there was this sense of, well, do we do this recording or are we charlatans? Or is this actually a really important conversation to have publicly? So I'm kind of curious, Hayley, with your psychology hat on, and you weren't in last week's conversation. How do you make sense of what we've shared?
I think there's a couple of things. I think first of all, it's to be expected that we're all feeling this way. I came across a really interesting article from INSEAD by a professor of neuropsychology who was talking about the way our brains are wired, and because of the amount of stress and uncertainty people are facing at the moment, the kind of the feelings of confusion and in some instances depression are to be expected, and we shouldn't necessarily rail or fight against that, but recognise that that's a natural part of, I want to say journey, but journey doesn't feel the right word, but you know what I'm saying. It's a natural part of what's happening. It's a way that our minds protect us and help us make sense of that. So I think that's the first thing. It's how we're all feeling is perfectly natural. And as you were talking, Jen, you used the word humility. I think it was maybe Melissa who used it as well at the beginning. And what's been really interesting to me, and I don't know if Tim's been finding this as well, because I know Tim does a lot of work around leadership, is looking at organisational political leaders and how well or not they're handling what's going on. And I think one of the things I'm consistently seeing is either humility or a lack of. So when we have humble leaders are much more likely to say, do you know what, I don't have the answers about how the hell we're going to get out of this, but I'm going to speak to people who might well do. And then you have those who feel they have to be that strong leader and have all the answers. And I think we could make a good guess as to which country and which organisations have which type of leader at the moment. So those are the two things that have kind of popped into my head, hearing what you're saying.
Well, it's interesting. That's one of the things that we were sharing, because we were looking at some of the things we've seen in the 3 months. One of the things I've seen is there's some of the leaders who, are very much embodying this autocrat on steroids. So quite the opposite of the humble leader, and not listening to their leadership teams, making wildly bizarre decisions that make no sense with strategy or any of the foundations they've built in their organizations. And so it really illustrates, it may be a bit difficult to guess which countries that's happening in, because I suspect it might be happening in all. That's a pattern we're seeing. So I think this means that, obviously we're going ahead with this podcast, but what it does mean that, this episode comes to you from a position of learning out loud and deep humility. Because if the four of us as leaders in our occupational spaces are feeling this way, then it's a no-brainer that it's occurring in organizations. And so what we thought we'd do with this episode is also unpack what were the tools and strategies that the four of us are personally using to navigate our way only forward at the moment. But before we get into some of those, if we look at some of the key takeaways from last time, let's just check in of, do they still hold up or were they wrong, right? So we talked about the importance of having a transition period and revisiting purpose. Does anybody want to speak to that in terms of where you see that playing out? Did firms have a transition period, and did they focus on purpose? Haley?
A few of my clients. So I think, as I said in the previous episode, the bulk of my clients are public sector. I work across other sectors as well, but the bulk are public. And I think when we spoke back in May, lots of my leadership clients were like, yeah, I know I'm dealing with a crisis in front of me, but we need to look at the recovery plan and the transition. And I think it's safe to say that those conversations are still happening now in August, but it's almost like the timetable keeps having to shift. And obviously with with all organisations, you can't just look in. This is a conversation I've been having with a lot of organisations. I think those that just look in and look at their systems within and their departments and their processes are in serious danger if they haven't already shut down. Those that look up and out at what others are doing and how that might impact their system, so government decisions, policy changes, those that are consistently looking up and out and paying attention, I think are better able to navigate that transition. So the transition's got longer, and the importance of kind of looking up and out consistently.
Yeah, it's a nice insight, actually. Yeah. Melissa, do you have any thoughts on either what Haley shared or what we said last time?
It's interesting, because I was thinking that that one of the things from last time, we talked a lot about purpose and that being connected to purpose was sort of more important than ever. And to a certain extent, I think that's still true. I think the organisations that are really connected to who they, to that organisational DNA and very clear on it, are possibly doing better. But at the same time, I think what we also have seen really interestingly in the last few months is some organisations that have radically changed what they do and been really successful at it. I'm thinking in Melbourne, there's a company called Stage Kings that that are responsible for doing staging for large events, so concerts and things like that. And they transitioned into using all of their equipment and their people to make desks and home office equipment, and they've been really successful. And so I guess that's an example of, like, if they'd stuck to their original purpose, they'd be still sitting around twiddling their thumbs with no work to do. So I think it's very interesting, that sense of knowing who you are and being really true to it in a way that's, does that make sense?
Can you just repeat the end of your sentence for where you froze?
Oh, sorry. It's about being true to yourself, but not bloody minded about it. Like, it's being true to yourself, but sensible about it.
Yeah. Nice. So we also talked about, and I think, Tim, you were really strong on this, the human-centered organisation. And I think we all spoke about self-compassion and being conscious of pacing. How would you give the organisations a mark in regards to those attributes?
In terms of self-compassion?
Yeah.
Look, I think on the whole, leaders are doing a pretty good job of that, but I'm not sure that they are really connecting the right dots at this point, at least not in Australia. And I would link it back to what Haley and Melissa were saying about purpose. I think that I'm hearing a lot of talk about focusing the organization on sort of big purposive goals, getting people, reminding people about what the organization is really about. But I don't think I'm hearing a lot about reinventing the organization to make it more human-centered. And I think that's a real missed opportunity. I think that, I mean, leadership is fundamentally care. It's fundamentally about looking after the people who are with you, the person to the left, the person to the right, taking them on a journey, giving them meaning, giving them purpose through those everyday activities that you conduct in the workplace. I think for a long time, many organizations, they've had their goal, it's way out there in the future, they're charging towards it, and they're just kind of feeding people these little hits of purpose, saying, come on team, let's keep on going, we just need to get there. The game has changed completely. You can't see all the way into the future now. We're like scuba divers in murky water. We can just see a few feet ahead, and leaders need to pull their focus in, and in thinking about purpose, they need to zero in on the people that they're with, and they need to think about how can I restructure this organization to make it an organization that is deeply compassionate, that is deeply rewarding for the people who are there, so that when we come out of this thing, we're a different kind of organization, really committed to purpose, from the ground up, from our everyday activities, from the way that we relate to each other in the workplace and work together. So yes to purpose, but let's just kind of pull our focus in and think about creating purpose within the workplace. I think that will set us in good stead going forward.
Mm. I think in general, if we think about that self-compassion thing, I think in general, people really embraced that strongly over the last 3 months. I've seen a lot more relaxing of perfectionism and acceptance of, where they're at, of people being really comfortable at pushing back on, no, actually, I need to have my video off because I've got a load of washing behind me. And, and I think the remote working and the schooling requirements and all the other negotiations created this necessity for self-compassion, that, people learnt self-compassion through going through that process. Or that's what I feel like. Well, I know I did. I really leaned heavily into it, but I was seeing it in a lot of other people that I was having conversations with and meetings. Melissa or Hayley, any thoughts on that? The state of self-compassion in the last 3 months?
I think I agree with what you've said. I think that there has been more of it evident, but what I'd also say is that I think I've also seen it more directed outwards. So there's just more kindness going on. I think, which is great. I think that we've become just much more forgiving of each other. I was in a meeting the other day, which was pretty high stakes. It was preparing for a pitch to clients, and everyone, was pretty desperate to win this work, and there was a lot of pressure. And the lead person on the call, everyone working from home, had a child constantly yelling, "Mum, Mum, Mum," in the background, wanting to pull her out. And she said, "Excuse me, I've just got to, deal with this." And the conversation after she left was, "Oh, we feel sorry for her, basically. Poor her, that's really hard, it's really tricky for her." No frustration, "Hey, this is important, get back to your computer," which was kind of lovely, especially in a stressful situation where, it's easy to kind of let go of that. So that, I think, is nice and something we needed anyway. It's not something we should have to wait for a pandemic to have happen. But yeah, I think that expression into kindness has been kind of an upside.
It's interesting. I was going to say something completely different from Melissa.
Go for it.
I think, yes, we've been seeing increase in self-compassion. I think in some instances I've seen that border on self-obsession. I'm beginning to see compassion for others wane. And the reason how I'm seeing that is I am now working with lots of middle managers who are if they're not burnt out already, they are absolutely hurtling towards burnout. And it's because they're not experiencing a lot of compassion from their bosses. And people have fallen into that trap and feel unable to get out of the trap of back-to-back meetings, which we would have had in real life, have now kind of gone to Zoom. People feel unable to push back because it seems unacceptable. So actually, I'm not seeing huge amounts of compassion, or I'm seeing it wane, and that worries me a lot, because I'm dealing with the fallout. I just want to take a couple of steps back though, because there's something that Tim said that really struck me. I loved the analogy of the scuba diver in murky water. And that got me thinking around managers and leaders having to trust their instinct a bit more. Because when you said that, Tim, I had the Jaws music in my head. You don't know what's out there in the murk. And it kind of got me thinking that certainly lots of the managers and leaders that I work with, and I think as a culture in the UK, we're very rule oriented, so policy and process. And if it's not on a policy or a process, and the rules have there are no rules. It feels like very Game of Thrones. There are no rules anymore. And you have to trust your instinct. And so how do we help managers and leaders learn to re-listen to their instinct when they can't see in that murk around them? So that really kind of resonated with me.
I think we talked about the importance of mindfulness as a tool to I guess part of what you're saying, Hayley, is recognizing the role that our brains take during crisis, and the amygdala hijack, and how important it was going to be to tap into mindfulness as a way to create a steady state for our brains to be healthy. Did you see an uptick in it? Do you think people were practicing their mindfulness more?
Not enough in my book, but then I don't see everybody. I can only kind of,
you see the ones in trouble,
the people in front of me. Certainly I'm a big proponent of mindfulness and mindfulness meditation. I've done it myself for the last 8 years. I feel it when I don't do my daily practice. It's something that I recommend to a lot of clients, and I can see the benefits for the impact for those who do it and those who don't bother. But I think people have to come to that space themselves in their own time.
Well, I think it raises the difference between medicinal mindfulness, where you're doing it for that purpose of making yourself better or feel better, versus mindfulness in its true essence, that tapping into a state of equanimity because you are much more conscious of everything that happens. You're more present. Tim, you're located in Mindfulness Centre of Australia. Got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I'm sort of a struggling mindfulness practitioner myself, and I certainly I think that cultivating presence and calm and compassion and gratitude is absolutely vital for me when dealing with stress and uncertainty, as I imagine it's vital for others too. But look, I think really we're talking about leaders here. The problem I have with a lot of mindfulness discourse is that sometimes mindfulness is presented as something you do when you're taking time out. You go and sit on a mountain and you just recalibrate and get ready to come back into battle. But what I think what leaders need is more like the mindfulness of the warrior, because they are in battle, and they are like that scuba diver who's in the murky water, and as Hayley says, there could be a big shark just out of view, and they have to be sort of wide awake. I'm a scuba diver as well as a mindfulness practitioner, And I love that experience of being down there in the depths and not really knowing my way around. I feel at once incredibly calm and incredibly centered, but at the same time somehow like accelerated, excited, and my senses are heightened. And I think that's the kind of mindfulness that we need to cultivate at the moment, a sort of a slightly heightened sensibility that is yet present and composed and calm. It's a hard balance to achieve.
I think some of this taps into, you know, resilience and how resilient were we over the last 3 months. Melissa, you were sharing earlier, you've been coaching a leadership team across some modules and training in resilience, and they'd shared some feedback with you without naming them. Can you share a little bit of what they'd said?
Yeah, look, I think it was interesting, their reaction to this. One of the participants was very struck by an element in the learning called gratitude builds resilience, and had actually written that up as a poster on the wall for her team and introduced it as a standing agenda item in their team meetings, and that they were, every second team meeting, they were finishing by going around and everyone had to name something they were grateful for. And you said at first people were a bit resistant to it. They thought it was a bit dumb, a bit twee. But she said that it's actually over time, and by time we mean just weeks, the last few weeks, it's really become kind of quite an essential thing, and staff comment on it now and say that they do it at home with their children, and that it's really been sort of such a valuable thing to start thinking about in these weird times that we're in. And she even had a staff member come to her who was, you know, having a bad day and lots of problems, and he goes, I know, I've just got to think of something to be grateful for. And I thought that was lovely, that something so simple could have such an impact for people. So I think sometimes mindfulness can be a bit of a scary concept for people who aren't familiar with it, and it, you know, conjures ideas of you know, gurus sitting cross-legged for hours on an end. But, you know, something as simple as that, a gratitude practice, I mean, in a way, that's a form of mindfulness, of just, you know, taking a moment to center and be back where you are and think about what's going on for you. So just a simple practice like that can be really valuable.
Nice. So tell me, what surprised you over the last 3 months? What did you see that really surprised you? And I'll let you show me who wants to go first on that question rather than throw that at you. For the listeners, we have looks of deep thinking. Tim, talk to us.
Look, I'm not sure if this was a deep surprise for me, but it was quite a reminder and a bit of a wake-up call, really. When we last spoke, I was advocating innovation. I was advocating that leaders return to a startup mindset and think about creating like crisis response teams to innovate their way out of uncertainty. And I thought that was probably a bit of a stretch even at the time. There aren't so many companies that are really game for that kind of organizational renewal, even though it's absolutely vital in my view. But I was struck, and I'm still struck at the sort of the deep inertia amongst leaders to this point in the crisis, which is almost like this sort of unconscious resistance to the very idea of trying to do something differently. I've spoken to a number of leaders who still seem to have this kind of hibernation mindset. They're just sort of tightening their belts and battening down the hatches and let's wait and see, this thing can't last forever kind of thing. And I think there is something deeply unreasonable about that. And it's really made me think more deeply about neuropsychology and the deeply ingrained human resistance to accepting change and the need for change.
Mm. We could talk for a long time about that, but Hayley, you're perhaps either building off that or something else that surprised you in the last 3 months.
The thing that surprised me, because I've always liked to think that I'm quite a savvy person. And the thing that I've been surprised by is how utterly naive I've been and am about the extent of and the impact of privilege. So I think I touched on it in May. And I think with various events we've seen over the past few months, I've really seen that heightened through my own work. And the decisions that are being made. So I'll give you an example of how I've seen privilege play out. So I got approached by one very large organisation, large public sector organisation, and the chief executive jumped to, this is brilliant, everyone working from home, everyone's so productive and blah, 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 and that's it now, we'll never go back, this is a big public sector organisation, that's it. So commissioned their head of OD to do a piece of research into why everybody forever should work from home. And I had to have a very tough speak truth to power moment. This chief executive, highly educated, white, middle class male, in their 50s, didn't understand that, for example, some of their social workers in their 20s live in shared accommodation. I had a call with a social worker where she was sat on the stairs with her laptop because she lived in shared accommodation. Her boyfriend had nabbed the room first because he was on a call first with his boss. And so there's something about how privilege is playing out in some of the innovation or new ways of working that leaders think we now need to work to, because isn't it all wonderful? Well, no, it's actually not for a lot of people. And that's got me thinking about my positions that I take as a practitioner. And I feel a little bit ashamed, actually, about some of the recommendations I've made. So, yeah, that's kind of where my head's at the moment. I've been surprised at my own naivety and the naivety of others around privilege.
Gotcha. Look, I think for myself, I think I've been surprised by my own and other people's idea that we're facing kind of a linear problem that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think when I was looking back on listening back to our previous chat, that kept coming back into my head, that I thought I was in the middle of a story then that was coming to an end. And that was clearly not the case. Like, here we are, 3 months later, and we're still in the middle, really, with no end, in sight. And so I think that makes things really tricky for all sorts of things, but especially decision making. And I know we've touched on decision making a little bit and the murky waters and stuff, and I think we're going to probably explore that a little bit more. But I think the idea that it's not linear, and also that you can go backwards, like in Melbourne, for example, which seemed to progress through to a great stage and then regressed, and New Zealand has done the same thing. And so that's been the sort of bit of a wake-up call for me, is just to try and remember that it's not a nice, easily plotted story, and what page you're on anymore.
Could I just jump in there? I think that there's a really interesting comparison to be made between the way that Australia and New Zealand framed the crisis. The Morrison government came out with a roadmap to recovery, That was always their focus. It was a road we were traveling down and had various stages, and it was linear. So I think it's not surprising that many of us did just adopt that mindset. And now we feel like we're going backwards. New Zealand didn't have that approach. They had a series of levels, and they were very clear about what each level entailed in terms of your responsibilities as a citizen and so forth. And I think that really sort of subtly but decisively reframes the whole thing. At the moment, I have family in Auckland. They're back in lockdown. They know it's just going to be temporary. But I'm not sure they think of it as a matter of going backwards. They've just shifted back to that level they were in. And I think they acknowledge that as the country goes on, there will be a lot of like shuttling between these levels. I don't know if it makes a huge difference all told, but I think it's a subtle difference in the way that the whole situation is framed. And stories obviously are really important for the way we understand things.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
I think some of the things that have shocked me, and this plays to my naivety, optimism bias. So, I remember way back then in April, I'd written that there'd be 4 R's of organisational change. There'd be reimagining and reintegration and whatever my other 2 R's were. And in fact, what we saw was organisational change stopped. Unless it was mission critical and enabling a remote workforce, it stopped. So change consultants weren't being asked to help in how do we create this new future for our organisation, this opportunity. Change managers were stood down from projects. It was this real bunker down mentality at a time when, intellectually the opportunities have never been more rich. When you've got a destabilized system, you can create a lot of change. And so we had this incredibly destabilized system, but the response was to lock it down. And I think, it was interesting because I was chatting with one leader and his mindset was a real exception to what I was hearing from others, because he said, look, we made sure that our employees were safe. We made sure our customers were safe. We made sure our supply chains were safe. And then we accelerated every big moonshot idea we'd ever had of how we were going to build this organisation further, and we'd been given a gift that we had license to do things that everybody would have pushed back on. And I loved hearing that story, but gee, it's been a rare story. I think what surprised me also is, I guess, some of the cultural nuances of this and how this plays out. So I've seen organisations where, despite the government saying everybody should be working from home, they're organising lawyers to try and find loopholes on that. And they want their employees in at the workplace. And not surprisingly, the workers don't feel particularly safe psychologically or physically. But when you look at the cultural heritage of those companies, and there's been a couple that have bubbled up in this space, they've come from countries where crisis and war is the norm. And so there's this sense that what Australians are being asked to do is really quite soft. And, we're a bunch of sooks. This is not what you do we haven't grown up being namby-pamby to, the potential loss of life. And I found that really fascinating, the juxtaposition of perhaps legal frameworks in the workplace versus the cultural nuances of who the owners are and what they expect. So I didn't see that coming. I think the other thing is, what I'm seeing though, and this will play back to, my optimism state, is I'm seeing phases at the moment. I think March and April was very much about, holy crap, we're in a crisis, triage. I think May and June was steady the ship, right? And this was we stop all organisational change. And, our leaders are expected to steer through uncharted waters. And then July, and now coming into August, we're going, oh, holy crap, our leaders actually don't have the skill set to steer through uncharted waters. How can we get them help? So that's kind of, it's interesting to sort of track the data and say what's happening, in terms of what we're seeing. One of the things, and Hayley, you picked up on this you mentioned privilege. One of the things that has happened in the time since we met last time was the murder of George Floyd in the USA. So we recorded this on May 21st, and I believe the murder was May 25th. So you saw the rise of Black Lives, or the invigoration and the urgency around Black Lives Matter. And certainly in Australia, there was, renewed focus on Indigenous deaths in custody and police brutality, and systemic models of racism, which, I guess added another layer of difficulty into what was a difficult world. Any thoughts around that? And I know that's a very broad question, but in terms of, if we'd seen that, where does that fit into our consciousness of leading organisations?
So it's been fascinating to me, because I've been watching this really closely, and I've always been interested and paid attention to intersections. So I've always been interested in intersectionality, because what happened to George Floyd shouldn't happen to anyone. But it's interesting to me, he was a black man, and you'd had the death of Breonna Taylor, black woman, didn't have as much, obviously has had quite a lot of media attention, but not as much. So we start to see intersections come into play, and stuff around caste, and it's been really interesting to me seeing organisations of different sizes, different sectors handle that or not. So I think in the middle of the pandemic, when everything's already heightened, you then have this, and rightly so, but I think that's exposed organisations even more. And so those organisations who thought it was just enough to post a black square and put some platitudes, customers are leaving them. So we talked about this, didn't we, in May? I said people, I think, are becoming much more conscious about the kind of businesses that they want to give their money to, and I think this has brought this to the fore. I think so that's one thing. I think there's also something, it's been really interesting seeing some of my fellow professionals, and you might well have seen this as well, dive into the diversity and inclusion space. And I think, again, it's incumbent on us as experts to know our limits of expertise. So I've been approached by quite a few organisations saying, could you help us with diversity and inclusion? Do you do? And I've had to say, no, that's absolutely not my area of expertise. I know some brilliant people who can help you. And so it's been really interesting to me seeing what I see as some shameful practice, actually, people taking advantage.
The bad actors.
Yeah, so those are the things that have, I think it's exposed organisations even further, but it's also made me question some of my own peers in my profession and how they behave. I feel like everybody's just exposed at the moment.
It was really interesting, because when I looked at it, and as a result of that prompted me to go deeper in my anti-racism work. And one of the things that I've learnt about it is, and I was looking at within my occupational space, right? So organisational change practitioners. And at the moment, you've got all of these organisational change practitioners going, whoa, we're really good at creating change and managing change. Let us at racism. We'll be able to sort this, Let's come in with our capes are flowing and do what we do, because we do change. Whereas the deeper you get into it, you realise, how humbling it is to know how much you don't know, and that your role in being an effective ally is actually to pause and to learn before you move to action. And in recognising that, it struck me the parallels between our last call. So we're leaping into action going, woohoo, follow our advice, and this is where the experts in this space. And 3 months later, we're going, actually, we probably need to pause and reflect on our own struggle with this, you know? It feels
And
like
it was interesting.
there's a
Well, it was
model.
interesting, Jen. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was, sorry to jump in, but I saw you post something about a month ago asking if there were any non-white, non-Western change models, frameworks, and I've done the same thing, because I've sat here thinking I lecture, and Tim might have felt the same, Melissa might have felt the same. I lecture a lot on leadership and organisational development, and I realise I'm part of the I'm just constantly sharing stuff from the last 50 years that comes from Ivy League, you know, Western thought processes, very white, very educated, very middle class. So I'm part of the problem because I'm sharing stuff. But when I've been looking what else is out there, I struggled. I've come up short, and that's, you know, that's partly down to me. But yeah, that's and I saw that you were struggling as well, Jen. I don't know if the other two have found that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. No, I was reading the work of a design academic just yesterday who was talking about the lack of non-Western voices in the design thinking world. I think this is a really big and important issue, and the first thing I want to signal is that in coming from the startup and innovation world, I have to acknowledge I come from one of the, you know, it's kind of like the whitest, most privileged and exclusionary spaces of contemporary industry. Huge problems there need to be addressed. I think what the Black Lives Matter movement has brought to light is these massive inequalities and fault lines running through developed societies, which, you know, as white middle class privileged people, we mostly, to our shame, are quite happy to just kind of like forget about, and you know, until there is a massive explosion, and suddenly we go, oh my God, this is, life is terrible for these people. But the reality is the capitalist society that we all benefit from as professionals is premised on structural inequality and to a large extent structural racism too. So it's a very big issue. I think we need to look to leaders right at the top of our societies for change in this regard. And I like to think that the Biden-Harris partnership in the States is up to that challenge, and it can really lead change from the US, because that country sorely needs change. I think that, no, that's about all I think, actually. I'll pass the baton to Melissa.
I probably don't have a lot more to add than what's been said. I guess all I'm trying to do personally is to I don't know, lead by example. I'm trying to educate myself and to learn what I can, and to give space and voices to diverse diverse voices when I can. So that's, yeah, I'm just trying to do the best that I can in my little circle at the moment, which I don't know if that's enough, but yeah.
Actually, I've remembered what I was thinking before. I was going to make the point that, you know, if you look at the history of ideas, getting a bit philosophical here, you see that new ideas, new thinking, new knowledge emerges out of centers of power. And so you really can't separate class and privilege from the production of knowledge. It's no surprise that when you look outside of the dominant centers to, you know, the subaltern communities of the world, you don't tend to find the same depth and richness of ideas to draw on, simply because knowledge tends to be produced in these centers of power. So I think that is precisely why it's incumbent on us to really heal these divides and address social inequality, not just in nation states, but globally, if that's not too big an ask. Because if we do want, and we do need to draw on the richness and diversity of our global tribe, and the only way to really unlock all the knowledge and potential that we have in all our different cultures is to empower those different cultures and get people out of poverty, but find ways to actually enable them to become centers of power themselves in their own right. I think we see a lot of interesting stuff happening in China. Everyone's terrified of China, and there are good reasons to be worried about the Chinese government, but the cultural evolution and the social, technological, cultural evolutions happening in China are just mind-blowing. It's just a great example of how sort of knowledge just rides in on the back of new power structures.
Can I just point something out as well? So I'm going to call it out because it will no doubt somebody somewhere will put it in the comments box somewhere. There are 4 white faces. Brady Bunch. So so there's something about, if we do one of these moving forward, I've really loved seeing it's something called Pass the Mic.
Yep.
Pass the mic. So I'm happy to pass the mic to someone else if you decide to run one of these again, Jen, and I'm happy for somebody different to sit in my space, who is completely different from me and has a different worldview. And I have some people that I can suggest.
I think that'd be fabulous. I had attempted to pass the mic several times. It's interesting. It coincides with there's these great educators on anti-racism. One of them is a woman by the name of Ebony Janice Moore, who did a really powerful lecture on white urgency is violence, and the concept that when they did pass the mic, so I guess my interpretation, we all rushed to tap someone who was Black, Indigenous, person of color and say, please take my podcast, please take my, and then we let it go. We did our bit and then we didn't. And that's actually quite traumatic to Black, Indigenous people of color. And so what I've said to the people that I've offered to is like, this is a anytime offer. Anytime you want to come in and take this podcast, it's yours, because I recognize at the moment this heightened attention has an energetic level of demand that I would never experience. And so for me to say, well, look, here's my podcast, you've got to come on the next one, is actually an unfair requirement. But I thank you for bringing that up. And, absolutely, I think that would be a really important evolution of this podcast concept. Yeah, cool. So I said at the beginning, sorry?
We'd miss you, Hayley.
No, you wouldn't. Whoever passed the mic on to, they'd be so brilliant. You'd be like, hey, you.
Hey,
so I'd want them to pass the mic on. It becomes so you get such richness of diversity, diverse views, and it's not just about colour either. It's about diversity in all its forms. Neurodiversity, for example.
I am totally down with you being my podcast booker.
10% commission, it's fine.
You get 10% of all the love that's fed to us.
Exactly.
Okay, so we did say at the beginning of this we were going to unpack some of the tools that we personally have used over the last 3 months in recognising our humility, our stuckness, our pessimism. Tim, do you want to kick off with what's you found really helpful personally in leading in your space?
Well, 2 things, I think, and both of them are kind of philosophical, or quite philosophical. The first goes back to our talk about mindfulness and the importance of mindfulness. I get a lot of value out of reading and practicing Stoic philosophy, which is, I think, it tends to be misunderstood. When people think of the Stoic, they think of the stiff upper lip, just kind of like deal with it kind of mentality. But Stoicism is much more nuanced than that. It's really about, it centers on acknowledging just how much of life is beyond one's control, and accepting that, and focusing on what is within our control, which is our capacity to manage our emotional responses and fundamentally our judgments, the judgments we make about things, because often one finds if one can shift one's judgments, one shifts one's perspective on a problem and often relieves a lot of the stress that one's dealing with. So I think Stoicism is a really good practical philosophy to look into at this point of time. The other thing that's really interesting me at the moment is the work of a guy called Otto Schwammer, who teaches at MIT in business there. He's published a book called Theory U, and it's all about this rather strange idea of learning to lead from the emerging future. I think a large part of the reason why many leaders today are struggling to engage with uncertainty is because, by and large, they lead from past experience. They just think about how we've done things before, and they just try and reiterate that maybe in a slightly different way. And when the situation is such that that no longer makes sense, many leaders find themselves a bit stumped. Schwammer's idea is that when we're facing deep uncertainty, you have to go through a process of letting go of what you know and engaging in a process of seeing and sensing what's happening around you, slowly forging impressions of what is emerging in this time of uncertainty. And of course, this is best done with a team of people. And then once you've identified a potential opportunity, prototyping a new way forward, testing, learning, and just slowly piecing together a new path into the future. I think it's a difficult thing to do, but it's possibly the only way to make headway when you can't see the way ahead. You've got to do a bit of exploratory work and just feel your way forward as best you can. So those would be my two tools.
Gotcha. Melissa?
I would say I read a really great article recently, and I'm just going to look up the name of the author because that's the right thing to do. John Hagel, about the trust pyramid, and he came up with a kind of a twist on different concepts of trust. And at the bottom of the model was humility, and we talked about that right at the beginning a little bit. And I've been recommending this article and talking about it with the leaders that I've been coaching, and saying that I think now is the time for humility, and humility is a great way of building trust. And I think for a lot of leaders, it feels a bit counterintuitive because they feel like they should have the answers, and that their people are looking to them for inspiration, and don't want to hear that you as a leader are actually struggling yourself and that you don't know everything. But I think, it only takes a brief look at the headlines in the newspapers, as we talked about earlier, just to see the different leaders around the world, and those that are practicing a little bit of humility, as opposed to those that are continuing in their very patriarchal, authoritarian, I know everything and I have all the answers. We're just clearly seeing the success of those two approaches. And so I found that to be a really good and useful tool to talk to people about. The second thing has really been around decision making, and this is a personal thing as much as a thing I'm talking to others about. And that's just around the need to be less reliant on instinct, actually, and for decision making, to be very data driven with your decision making. I think, we talked about the amygdala hijack and all that sort of thing. I think the fact that emotions are so heightened at the moment, that, you know, our own mental states can be very chaotic just from the environment that we're in. And if you're a leader, then you've got, you know, even more pressures. And I think that it's really important to take a moment and not just react from, you know, from the hip. Shooting from the hip. It's take a moment, breathe, think, respond. It's more important than ever to just have that moment of thinking. And it, you know, that's nothing new. It goes back to the whole thinking fast, thinking slow, all of that sort of stuff. I think now is the time for systems 2 thinking about, you know, just really just taking a moment to consider the data and not just relying on your gut instinct, because I think our guts are all a little bit kind of unhappy at the moment. So that's that's the 2 things that I've been relying on.
Yeah. Hayley, what about yourself?
There's a very simple, or deceptively simple, technique that I've been sharing with lots of my coaching clients, and it's one that I use myself. So I think there's it's a word that's popped up throughout this conversation, about being conscious and mindful. And at a time when we feel completely and utterly out of control, getting some semblance of control back is really important. And we're not passive beings, you know. We all play a part in whatever happens. We play our part too. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So quite a few of my management clients talk about feeling, you know, oh, I'm up till 2 a.m, going through my emails. And my question is, well, whose choice is that? Who's forcing you to do that? And that kind of makes people stop. And so the technique I've taught people is, the first thing is to notice that you've gone into behaving in a certain way, whether that's going through your email at 2 a.m, or not saying that thing that you really want to say to your boss, the chief exec. Notice that you're doing it. And then this just takes a few seconds in your mind just to position it as a choice. So, okay, so I can now either choose to keep looking at my emails at 2 a.m, and I can choose not to say anything to my boss. What are the gains of that, and what are the losses of that? Or I could make another choice, which is I could choose to shut my laptop down and go to bed, or I could choose to say that thing. What are the gains of that? What are the losses of that? And then quickly weighing that up in your mind. And you could then think, actually, I'm going to keep looking at my email because the gains of that outweigh the not. But own your choice. That there's been a lot of tough love, Hayley, with clients recently, is that own your choice, because it's a choice you are making. You might like to let yourself off the hook that you're not making a choice, that you're not. You are making a choice in every given moment, but we don't notice the choices that we're making. And a lot of my clients have come back and just said that simple thing has made such a difference to them, just feeling in control. And the final thing is, at a time when we're feeling overwhelmed, we can forget to notice. Yep. So a trick that a few of my clients have used, so for example, I've got one who's put a post-it note in the corner of her laptop which says gains versus losses, that acts as a trigger. And I've got another one, he's put alerts on his phone that pop up every couple of hours which says, are you making conscious choices? And just taking that moment to take some control and ownership back is important.
Some nice tips there. I think for me personally, what has given me the greatest gain is probably referencing Melissa's observations, and that is getting all over the data. So rapid cycles of data-informed decision-making, probably faster than I would have done a year ago, you know, reviewing everything from the socials to the Google Analytics to, you know, whatever source of data I have, I'm currently triangulating and reassessing, you know, which direction, how am I moving forward? And because I think in recognizing it's not that I doubt my intuition, it's not that I doubt my gut. It's recognizing that, you know, I am in a different mental state than I would have been 6 months ago. And so doing the same thing in an altered state is probably not going to be, you know, a healthy way of going forward. Let's go around the traps. The next 3 months, where does this take us? What, recognizing that nobody wants to be an expert anymore or a guru. Nobody has all the answers. We're just sitting across each other at a metaphorical bar. What's your thoughts for the next 3 months? The bar went very quiet.
I think that silence is so telling, isn't it?
I'll go. So
Yeah.
I'll come in at it personally. I'm you're all going to laugh at me going, oh, she's so naive. I'm hopeful, and the reason I'm hopeful is because my diary is nearly full in September and October, and November's filling up. So I think as lots of organisations have made sense and recognised this isn't going away, let's just convert everything and do some new stuff. From a personal perspective, as a business owner and a consultant, the fact that I've got loads of work back makes me feel hopeful that organisations are better, the organisations that I work with are better navigating that twisty turny road that we're all on. That's how I feel.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, I look, I feel hopeful too. I must say, I think that the second waves around the world have been a real wake-up call for leaders, and I think that should be enough to make us all realize that we are in a state of crisis, and we need to shift up a gear. Or is that down a gear? I'm not sure. It's been a long time since I drove a manual car. Looking back to the GFC back in 2008, lots of organizations just hunkered down through that period and tried to ride it out, and many of them went under. But the organizations who actually invested in innovation and attacked the problem on the front foot, well, research shows that in the States, they outperformed the Standard & Poor's Index by 10% through the crisis, and then coming out the other side of the crisis, these companies outperformed the market by 30%. So yeah, I mean the statistics are clear. There is great gain to be found in actually innovating through a crisis. So actually, my partner and I have, we decided we would not let the crisis go to waste, and we've put together a research business which is specifically for companies that are dealing with uncertainty and thinking seriously about innovation. And we put our foot out the door, and yes, there's a lot of interest. So that does make me feel hopeful.
Awesome. Melissa?
I don't know that I'd say I feel hopeful. I think I feel like there's a lot of work ahead of us. And if I am, I guess, addressing my comments to people who work in communication or who are responsible for communication in some way, I think there is a very, very big responsibility on you to create good narrative that is instructive and trustworthy and truthful, but that doesn't sort of mistakenly, even accidentally, lead people down wrong paths. And I guess I'm reflecting a bit on what Tim said earlier about that difference between a roadmap and levels, and I think that there's something interesting there, without wanting to get too caught up in sort of terminologies. But I think that's really interesting. I've been reflecting a lot on trust. I think there's a saying now that we're not in a post-truth world, we're in a post-trust world, and I think that our communication and our media have a lot to answer for in that space. And I really do worry about the future of how we digest the information that we need. It's difficult to know even whether to trust the news outlets that you trust. And so I think if you're in any way responsible for communication, you have a very big responsibility, and you should, I'm in mind of is it Spider-Man, I think, with great power comes great responsibility. Yeah, I think, we're not superheroes, but we have great power, and we need to take that great responsibility very, very seriously right now.
So it's undies on the outside and more presses with Hayley's sketch notes, basically. That's how we're going to digest information. Lovely, lovely. I think for me, whilst as I said, I am seeing now that organisations are turning to how do we support our leaders through training and around their mindset and skill set in being more agile. It's a bit of a self-serving observation. I will acknowledge that one too. But I actually think there's something about community, going to an increasing focus on community. And I think for many of us that will mean different things. I think as we continue to have restrictions through stages, you'll come to depend much more on your local communities, that hyper-localization that's going on. But I think in business, it also means looking at strategic partnerships and alliances, because your business community will be your safety net. Now, the interesting thing, I guess, is that's probably easier to conceptualize when you run a small business or a consultancy like we do. What does community mean to the big Australia Post, the big government agencies, Telstra, those kind of things? Got no idea what that actually means. I just have a feeling that it's going to become very important in not just surviving, but actually reorienting your whole organisation. So we are coming to the close of this. The three of you have once again been extraordinarily generous with your time and your thoughts and your humility. If we can go around the room, what would you most like the listeners to know or help you with? How can our listeners help you with what's going on in your world? Tim.
Oh, look, just be kind, I think. Just be kind. I know that this has been a theme of all our discussions, and actually, it wouldn't have been something I would have said 3 months ago, but it's a reflection of how I've learned from our conversations. I think community is really important, and I think we need to just double down on building good relationships, being empathetic and kind to one another, because we're going to need a lot of that going forward.
So you want people to be more kind to you?
I am sorely mistreated, Jen. If I could explain it to you, I can't.
Hayley, how can the listeners help you?
Is recognising there's no shame in asking for help. Whether that's asking me or any of you. In fact, the best leaders know when to ask for help and who to ask for help. That's the first thing. The second thing is, it's a bit Jerry Maguire, help me, help you. We're just going to go around in circles now. So, for example, I put out on LinkedIn the other day, because people go bonkers for my sketch notes, as you said, Jen. But it feels a bit selfish. I draw ones that I'm interested in. So I put a little message out saying, what's going to help you? What would you like me to draw or summary of? One person came back to help me help you. Tell me what you'd like to learn more about or know more about, and I'll draw it or write about it. Just drop me a line.
Okay, challenge accepted. That's fabulous. Melissa, how about yourself?
Well, I'm going to take Hayley up on that. I'm definitely going to ask for something. I love Tim's idea about kindness, because I'm a kindness advocate from way back, and kindness has been a bit of a personal mantra, philosophy. I don't know quite what the word is for me for a long time. So I think kindness in the world, you know, it's never been more true that we have to be kind, because we just don't know what battles other people are fighting. You know, it's always been true, but it's especially true now. Being a little bit cheeky as well, along with Jen, we've just made our weekly collaboration program, Busting Silos, available on demand now. So you can just go to the website and sign up and get weekly e-lessons in how to better collaborate with your colleagues and pretty much anyone in your life. So I would also say there's never been a better time to be kind, and never been a better time to know how to collaborate with other people. So yeah, check out bustingsilos.com.au.
Terrific. My request of the listeners, I'm getting in with a request. I just think there's been some incredible gems dropped in this podcast. This may not have been our smoothest or eloquent podcast we've ever done. I think, you know, the minute we dip into how do we do this from a position of learning out loud and being a little bit more humble about it, it gets awkward, but that's the point. These conversations are awkward, and it's really important to have them out loud. So listeners, if you've got someone you think should listen to it, please share it with them. If you've got leaders in your organizations, please put it on your Yammer, put it on anywhere. We don't care. But we would really welcome you sharing this with the people who you think need to hear it. But for now, stay safe, stay well, and stay very, very kind.